Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 213, Passover Your Way. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rothberg.
And today we continue our exploration in the lead up to Passover of all kinds of creative ideas and approaches to making Passover more meaningful, which, as we've said before, is really just a case study for how we might do that with a wide variety or perhaps all Jewish rituals in this transition to the next Jewish era. Today, we are excited to welcome two leaders of a Denver-based organization called Judaism Your Way. Judaism Your Way was founded in 2003 as an independent Colorado-based Jewish organization creating innovative approaches to including Jews and loved ones in Jewish community. As they state, their unique organizational model allows them to deliver meaningful and relevant Jewish experiences without a building, membership, or dues. Their signature programs include free high holiday services at the Denver Botanic Gardens, what they call the open tent bar mitzvah ceremony preparation and officiation, and support and officiation at interfaith weddings. Our guests today are Brian Field and Caryn Aviv. Brian Field is the founding rabbi of Judaism Your Way, prior to which he was a congregational rabbi. He has rabbinic ordination from the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College and cites as influences Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, one of the founders of Jewish Renewal, and Ken Wilber, as having guided his vision of a maximally inclusive Judaism that plays a robust role in the healing of the planet and the liberation of all human beings. Caryn Aviv is a rabbi of recent vintage. She just received her rabbinic ordination from Aleph, the Alliance for Jewish Renewal, where Lex is also a student. And prior to that, she was an academic. She has a PhD in sociology and anthropology and taught Jewish studies and sociology at the University of Colorado at Boulder and the University of Denver. Caryn Aviv has written 3 books, including Queer Jews, New Jews, The End of the Jewish Diaspora, and American Queer, Now and Then. At Judaism Your Way, she is a rabbi and education director, and she is the leader of the Open Tent Bar Mitzvah program. We are so thrilled to have Brian and Caryn here for this conversation, so let's jump right into it. Brian Field, Caryn Aviv, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
It's great to be here.
Great to be here.
So, Brian, I thought we could just start off by getting a little bit of the story of how Judaism Your Way came about before we jump into the Passover hook, which I promise our listeners we have here.
So Judaism Your Way came about because a recent demographic survey of the Jewish people showed what won't be a surprise to most of your listeners, that most people who identified as Jewish or who were connected to Jews were not participating in synagogues or other legacy Jewish institutions. And there was a concern about how to bring those people back or how to reach out to those people. And Judaism Your Way emerged because a couple of funders realized that there were no rabbis in the state of Colorado who were officiating weddings between someone who was Jewish and someone who was not. And the statistics were showing that this was an increasing number of people. They thought, well, why shouldn't the Jewish community, if it's concerned about this, hire a rabbi to do this kind of work? So they went to the Jewish Community Center, and the Jewish Community Center said it was too controversial, it wasn't interesting. They went to the Jewish Federation, got the same response. So they said, okay, well, let's do this on our own. And back in 2004, I heard about this opportunity. And in August of 2004, we set up shop. And by January of 2005, we had come up with the name Judaism Your Way. There were 2, then 3 of us. And now there are 8 of us, including 4 rabbis, working at Judaism Your Way here in Denver, but also serving the greater Denver area, including Boulder. So the people who came up with the idea for an organization and were the initial funders were Don and Sue Sturm, who are owners of a regional bank here in Colorado. And they are actually an interfaith couple. And when it was time for them to get married, could not find a rabbi here in Denver. And they had other experiences, both as parents of young children in Denver, as well as philanthropists in the Denver community, which showed them that there were lots of needs that weren't being met. And they spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to set up an organization that could address some of those needs. And here we are.
And Caryn, it would be great to get a little bit of your story before we jump into some of this Passover stuff too, because it's one of these rare circumstances where we met each other about 15 years ago. I was a Hillel director. You were a professor, and we were at a conference that was put together by an organization called Jumpstart, which is still around, and they were doing this kind of initial thinking about this growing ecosystem of what they were calling, and people were calling Jewish innovation at that time. And you were kind of the reporter. You were there taking notes and put together an essay, kind of trying to put some of the pieces together, which was, by the way, an essay that I loved and send around to this day because it was such a encapsulation of what it was going on at a very early point in all this. Anyway, flash forward, all of a sudden I realized that you're functioning in a rabbinical role in this organization, Judaism Your Way. What happened? How did that happen?
What happened was I didn't have tenure in academia and I was bored. So I wanted to work with a wider group of people than college students, who I love to this day. But I was in a discernment process, asking myself, how can I be of service to the world and translate my love of Judaism and my academic knowledge of Jewish studies into something that would have more of a ripple effect impact in the world beyond academia. I met Brian through storytelling, and in that training, in that 2-year incubator project in Colorado, I really fell in love again with Torah. And that was the first spark for me in thinking, maybe this rabbi gig might be a better fit. And it sure feels like it's a hell of a lot more fun.
So this is good background. Now Passover.
Yeah.
Awesome segue. Smooth transition. Let's talk about Passover. So you have done a lot of really cool things with Jewish holidays. Notably, and maybe we'll get to this later, notably you've got a really, really big high holiday observance that attracts lots and lots of people in your area. But what has Passover been for you? And I'm curious about that on two levels. One is the general origin story of the early days of Judaism Your Way. What did you do with Passover? How did you tackle it in ways that were different from what other organizations were doing? Because like you described, Brian, it sounds like your organization was founded intentionally to fill gaps. So I'm curious how you did that with Passover. But as it's evolved over time, I know the last few years, you've taken on a really interesting approach to Passover, honing in on its tail end and actually sort of a little bit afterwards. And I'm leaving it up in the air. I'm not going to say what I mean, but I'm going to let you fill in that gap. What have the last few years of Passover been in addition to those early days?
When you think of Passover, I think most of us, we think of a Seder. And so that's what we thought of. And what's very cool about Seders is that the best of Judaism and Jewish spirituality is encapsulated in the Seder. It's basically a conversation using sacred texts about like the meaning of being human channeled through Jewish experience. So the first thing that we wanted to kind of lift up was the fact that Passover is not a 1 or 2 day holiday, but rather it's 7 or 8 days. And that we decided to hold a community Seder on the last night of Pesach, on the last night of Passover. And in the Passover myth, in the sacred story of Passover, what's happening is the Jewish people are crossing the sea. It's kind of the last step towards leaving oppression behind and entering into a new era, into freedom, which felt like a very powerful kind of ritual container for what our organization is about. You know, kind of feeding on that. Each year for several years, we offered Passover Seders that focused on a different theme of liberation. And so we did this for many, many years. And each year we wrote a Haggadah to speak to this specific theme. For a couple of years, we decided to direct the Passover Seder to the fact that in our area, there are a lot of Jews whose main spiritual practice or interest or orientation is Buddhism. And we wrote, and so we offered a couple of Jew booth Seders. We got between 100 and 200 people to come to these Seders. People seem to be very engaged in them. There's a lot of creativity, and we lost a lot of money doing each one. And so this goes from like the kind of the spiritual calling of organization to what it actually takes to run an organization. This was not sustainable. A couple of years ago, we made a decision to look at Passover very differently.
People carry around so much distress and ambivalence and confusion and pain and an experience in many cases of marginalization or feeling unwelcome in Jewish life. So what Brian alluded to, that the Passover Seder is the apex of our offering a more inclusive vision of what Judaism can look and feel like. And so that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, Brian is right. We were losing a ton of money. And I have to say that producing a new Haggadah on a different theme every year for one night only is so much work that it started to not make sense. So we came up with this idea of uplifting the holiday of Mimuna, which is a North African Jewish custom of celebrating the end of Passover at sundown. And I thought, what a shame that nobody knows about this in North American communities that I've traveled in. So that's one dimension of trying to uplift this holiday and do some education around Middle Eastern Jewish cultures and the rich heritage of those communities as part of our effort to be a model of multicultural Jewish inclusion. The second issue is that our idea for Mimuna came at a moment when we were reeling from a year of gun violence against Jewish communities and Muslim communities. And so the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh happened that October, and then there was a terrible massacre at a mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand. And Brian rightly identified that Jewish and Muslim communities have been experiencing a sense of vulnerability and oppression in this charged political climate that feels different than in previous years. Because Mimuna is historically a holiday celebrated by Jewish and Muslim communities on the North African Rim, this might be a moment of wonderful modeling of Muslim-Jewish cooperation and community building across the lines of difference.
There's one piece about the cooperation, the Muslim-Jewish cooperation. So there's a problem inherent in Passover. When Passover's over, you get to go back to eating all the bready treats and foods that we like to eat. Yet, technically, no one in the Jewish community has any leavened food goods. What the Jewish communities in North Africa would do is they would turn over all their flour, or sell, if you will, all their flour and all their goods to their Muslim neighbors, who would hold them for them. And then when Passover is over, their Muslim neighbors would bring all the food back to them, and they would bake together, and they would eat together, and they would party together. An ability to have a post-Passover celebration required the cooperation of Muslim neighbors. And so both as an act of healing as well as an act of allyship, it just felt like a very powerful act to lift up a holiday in our community that would offer a Jewish way for Muslims and Jews to celebrate together and to build relationships together.
As I'm listening to you talk both about Mimuna and about Passover, and it just got me thinking about the stable versus unstable dimension of Jewish practices and Jewish holidays. What I mean is that, a lot of people talk about Jewish practices like the most important thing is that we've been doing it this way for thousands of years, more or less the same way, and that they're struggling to find that connection, and almost any variant is problematic. And so even if something really is different, we pretend like, oh, that's not really a big deal. And the alternative is to say, no, these holidays are incredibly dynamic, and they're there to deal with whatever needs humans have today. But then the question I think that rises is, well, then what is the ancientness of them? Meaning if they're so plastic, people ask me the question all the time, well, what makes it Jewish? It seems like for many of the last 2,000 years, Jews tended to be the less powerful in society. And to have this holiday where we remember that we were slaves in Egypt every year and that we're no longer slaves sort of feels like, well, the point of that is to remind us that it could always be worse. And it tends to get better over time or something like that. But when we're in the position that we're in now, where we tend to be among the more powerful in society, first of all, that's not really the message that we need necessarily. And it's also not necessarily the greatest opportunity. And I tend to think about it as the great opportunity is to remember that idea that because the Torah says all the time, love the stranger because you were strangers. So now that we're the more powerful in society, we should remember that we didn't used to be, and we should make sure that we treat others the way we wish we were treated. But when you introduced that idea of so many Jews feeling kind of excluded from the Jewish community and this idea of getting together around a table, it introduced for me another idea, right? Another pressing need that many Jews have, which is to feel part of the Jewish community. And really, the high holidays don't often accomplish that because, we're all invited, but it doesn't really connect with a lot of people. So I don't know. I guess what you said opened up for me the possibility that there are a variety of needs that Passover really has an opportunity to meet today. And I guess I'm wondering both that question of, well, how do you think about how much to retain, but also, how do you think about the process that you go about running an actual organization, trying to say, well, here's the more pressing need, here's the raw material that we have, how do we kind of mix it up in a new way where it still feels ancient, still feels real, but is really dealing with what people needed to deal with?
I like to think of how we do our work, how we imagine and offer programming is to ask ourselves, who are we serving first? I'm quoting from Priya Parker right now, who has written a wonderful book about the art of gathering. And a Passover Seder is an example of a flexible ritual, like so many in Judaism, that have this patina of the ancient and are inherently flexible, evolving rituals because people bring to them their own needs and considerations and issues. That's why you have seen a proliferation of Haggadot, the ritual scripts that might focus on veganism and climate change, and they might focus on queer liberation. It's not that we were once slaves, it's people feeling oppression now in our daily lives. I would not be surprised if there were many emerging seders to gather Jews of color to talk about racism and police brutality and issues of structural inequality in American society now. So the ritual itself really offers a moment to reflect on the pain that we carry and also to express collectively our longing for freedom and liberation and a sense of spaciousness.
I wanted to kind of return to the tension that, Dan, that you were expressing in terms of, are holidays essentially dynamic or are they essentially conservative? Is it about tradition? Is it about innovation? At one point, every tradition was an innovation. So there's a few things I just wanted to kind of lift up about, kind of the classic rabbinic Seder that points to, like, I would say, a dynamic inclusion. One of them is that the Torah says probably more times than any other mitzvah, any other sacred principle, do not oppress the stranger, for you know the feelings of the stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt. What's really interesting about that is it doesn't say, don't oppress the slave, for you know the feeling of a slave, having yourselves been slaves in the land of Egypt. So somehow our memory of being slaves in Egypt has been transvalued into being strangers. And the notion of being strangers is at the heart of Judaism Your Way. How can Judaism be more inclusive? Who is being left out? Who is still the stranger? And you could be a stranger because you're queer. You could be a stranger because of race or class. You could be a stranger because you're not Jewish. There is so much strangeness that we still are wrestling with, and Passover is like the most powerful holiday to help us have the conversations that can free us from what estranges us from each other. Moses, the liberator of the Jewish people and the person through whom the Torah was going to be revealed, was actually intermarried. God, if you will, chose to reveal the Torah through an intermarried Jew. These are astounding things to be included in our Torah. And for most of Jewish history, they haven't been emphasized, but they are there. We are in a time that is crying for those pieces of Torah to lead. So there's all sorts of very powerful spiritual technologies in the traditional Seder for innovation and especially the innovation of maximal inclusion.
I have some questions that I think are important, and many of them are about pronouns. So you used a bunch of pronouns really prominently, Brian, and also Caryn, I think you did too, in talking about your work. And core among them, first off, Judaism, your way. Your is a pronoun.
Yes.
What's beautiful about it is both in English a singular pronoun that can be heard by somebody as my way, and your is a plural pronoun, which can refer to a group of yous. Y'all's way. Your is both individual and plural. Let's talk about that your, but also let's talk about the we. And now firmly in Passover for a second, but also more broadly than that. I have a lot of questions and, to be frank, some concerns about the Jewish we. And what I mean by the Jewish we is the way that the way that we talk about ourselves in rituals. And I think the most top of the list version of this is at Passover. So we were slaves in Egypt. Avadim hayinu. We were slaves in Egypt is a we phrase. And in the last few years, I've had a major learning process myself in the work that I do at Seders, but also generally when there's Jews and others in the room about that we. Because what I've learned, to me, what I assumed, and I know I'm not saying anything that I think is new to the two of you, by the way. But what I assumed is that people generally want to be included in the we, even if they're not Jewish. I generally came at this situation, if I'm doing a Seder and I'm talking about we were slaves in Egypt, I want everybody in the room to feel part of that we, whether they're Jewish or not. What I have been learning through and with people about is that some people actually feel it's important for them to not be that we. Even if they love somebody who's Jewish, if they're in a marriage relationship with somebody who's Jewish, even if they are close friends and go to a Seder every year, like for some people, and this is not all people, there are ways in which not necessarily being that Jewish we is part of their role. They love being, like, for lack of a better term, and I think we need a better term, but like an ally. They like being in the space, but not of the space. And so I'm genuinely curious, like, how do y'all work through that on Passover, on this holiday of we were slaves, Dayenu, that new suffix is a we suffix in Hebrew. God brought us out of Egypt. How do you deal with it on Passover? But also in general, how do you work through the ways in which some people are excited to be part of a Jewish space, but not necessarily see it as theirs?
I'm jumping at the bit to answer this question. I want to actually speak from my own personal experience about that last part of the question of having allies and beloveds at a Seder participating in Passover. So my partner, who we've been together for now 13 years, grew up in a devout Catholic family. And she realized very early on in her life, whoa, I'm gay. That's a problem for this church. And she also realized there is no pathway to leadership in this church where I can be who I am with full, authentic integrity. And she had aspired to be a priest. And the only option available to her was to be a nun. I'm giving you all of this background to amplify the potential solidarity and identification with the we in a Passover Seder, where allies and loved ones can experience a recognition, an identification, and a sense of community and solidarity with the we of we were slaves in Egypt, wherever they might carry some broken, hurt pieces of themselves, which applies to every human being on the planet, no matter what your identity. And usually half the people at my table for first or second night Seder are allies of Jews who have grown up Catholic or who identify as Buddhist or are Muslim, like an array of identities. And every year people say to me, Oh my God, I love Passover because I can really touch the pain of the Jewish people in this narrative and in this ritual experience with my own story. So I think Passover has tremendous capacity to be an expansive moment of who is part of the we. And I think for Judaism Your Way, to answer the first part of your question, if you look at our domain, our URL, it's Judaism My, Your, Our Way, because it's all one word. And there's something that I really love about that, because you could read it as Judaism My Way. You could read it as Judaism Your Way. And you could also read it as Judaism Why Our Way, or wait, I'm losing my train of thought. You could read it in a multitude of ways. And
Checks out.
That's so great. That's the trickster in me of like, ha, 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 we mastered all the pronouns. And people can find their way into Judaism however they might read the URL.
You know, it's interesting to hear that, Caryn, because I wonder sometimes whether people who are not Jewish or didn't grow up Jewish actually have a more powerful experience at a Passover Seder than the people who did grow up Jewish do. Because for those of us who grew up Jewish, it's kind of mixed up with so much, so many things, you know, that we may not always grab onto the really powerful parts. So one thing that is always on my mind is how can we make Passover more powerful for anybody, you know, for the people that are struggling with it. Another thing that I wanted to pick up on what you said earlier, Brian, and maybe, you know, if you want to answer both of these, you're welcome to, you know, but I was thinking about how you were describing the scene at the Exodus, right? Where I loved how you said it, right? That however it was exactly, but that God chose to reveal the Torah to somebody who was in an intermarried relationship. And so it makes me think about the possibility to just completely reorient the holiday of Passover, right? We tend to so readily say, look, Passover is about liberation. And so if we want to find new ways to make meaning of it, there are so many other liberations that are necessary at this point in time, and different people need to be liberated in different ways. And I'm a big supporter of that. We should do that. But there's another alternative, which is to say, hey, let's reimagine the entire meaning of Passover. Maybe it doesn't have to be about liberation. Maybe what we need Passover to be about today is the formation of a new people. Right? And that maybe Passover becomes a version of like an Independence Day. What if we really celebrated the new Jewish people in some way, you know, as Passover? And what new traditions might we add or even replace the Seder with some new kind of experience that would really emphasize that idea that, hey, we are also in a transitional period in Jewish history, and we also are seeing a growth of the people who are part of the Jewish people. And maybe it's not Passover, maybe we need another holiday, but it feels like we need some kind of holiday to really emphasize that piece.
One of the powerful things about a Seder is that, you know, it's not run by the religious institution. It's done in the family, or it's done by a circle of friends. So in certain ways, it has the potential to be very small d democratic. There's no kind of rabbi sitting over your shoulder telling you what you need to do. In the Seders that my family, you know, hosts, one of the things that we do is even a month before the Seder, we give people assignments. And for people who aren't Jewish, we will give them some background. So when we say, why don't you take on the 4 questions, you know, the 4 questions. And so we'll say, you know, talk about questions that you were never allowed to ask. When we make these offers, they can choose whether or not they want to identify personally with the historical Jewish story. Like, I have no idea what people are going to say at a Seder that I run. By and large, people really love it. I guess the other piece that I would share is that inherent in the name that we gave to the organization, Judaism Your Way, we distinctly chose the word Judaism and not the word Jewish. A lot of people said, why do you say Jewish your way? Because the reason is that not everyone who we're speaking to identifies as Jewish. But the spiritual technology that we're offering people to grow through, to use as part of their spiritual, kind of evolution is Judaism. So you can have a relationship with Judaism if you're not Jewish.
So first thing, this is to listeners for a second, not to our two incredible guests. Surprise, you all have assignments. Brian just beautifully talked about how there can be a real benefit in, I mean, assignment's a heavy, academic kind of term, but like in a form of preparation for Seder, in having an actual like action item. When I go to meetings, I write down my AIs. I like calling them that because it sounds like artificial intelligence, but my action items where I'm doing something between that meeting and the next meeting. Okay, so here's the action item or assignment for you, listener, like you, listener, not the listener in the next county over from you. I'm talking to you. So if you are hosting a Seder, my hope is that you will send a note to people that are coming to your Seder and ask them to bring any kind of contribution from their heart to the Seder, whatever it might be. And my inverse request is that if you are attending a Seder, that you will send a note to your host and volunteer some interesting contribution from your heart to the Passover Seder. And literally on this assignment, you can CC me if you would like to, lex@judaismunbound.com. That would be cool. Anyway, I love what you said about small d democratic. It's an aspirational value that we actually have to achieve. I sometimes worry that we assume home Seders are democratic because there's not that rabbi. I think you're right. There's a level that becomes more democratic, but there's a real danger that whether it's whoever's hosting or whoever's oldest or whoever has the most like cred in the room, like I sometimes don't even tell people when I'm at a Seder that's not my own that I'm like a rabbinical student, because the second I say that, like people turn their heads to me to make sure they don't say something wrong. My hope is that we can really strive for that aspiration. So that's an assignment, listeners, all you. Really like send us notes. Tell us what you take on there because we'd love to hear. So that really was designed as a question, challenge, assignment for listeners. Dan, take the next one. You've got a question for Caryn and Brian.
While we have you here, I'd love to take a little bit of a departure from Passover and just talk a little bit more broadly about the organization, Judaism Your Way, because I think it's so fascinating, the origin story that you shared at the beginning of the conversation, right? I mean, this could happen in any city, that there could be a few Jews who get around and say, hey, we're not getting what we need out of the institutions that there are. Let's make a new institution. I don't see that much of it happening. And I think that a lot of that is because nobody thought of it. So what's fascinating to me is now that we have this conversation with you where hopefully whoever listened to the beginning understands that such a thing can even happen, it would be great if you could share a little bit about, well, what have you built over that period of time? Like, what does it mean to be a Jew or someone else who is affiliated with Judaism Your Way? Do you even things that are as simple as like the business model, like do you pay dues? I mean, what is the nature of the relationship that a person has with this organization? What are the offerings? How do you maintain it economically? Like, it would be fascinating to hear any or all of that, just because I think it provides an incredible model that I think is not really around anywhere else or too many other places in the way that you've done it there in Colorado. So it would be great to hear more about it.
We began with a collaboration of visions between a rabbi, in this case that was me, and funders. The funders had a vision of like, we don't want barriers. And I think this organization required a rabbi who was willing to follow the advice of one of his professors in rabbinical school, which was, you gotta love Jews more than you love Judaism. Most of us who become rabbis because we fall in love with the beauty of Judaism. And so when you fall in love with something, you want to hold it really tight. And I think one of the core ingredients to the kind of work that we're doing is that we have to go from a closed fist, even held out of deep love and passion, into an open palm. I think that's hard for us who love Judaism so deeply to be willing to let it all go. If you love something, let it go kind of thing. I know that's a cliche. The Your Way is a constant reminder to me as a rabbi who is deeply passionately in love with Judaism. Brian, are you really doing it their way? Are you really helping them figure out what their way is? Are you holding on to what you've just kind of created a costume for what is really deep down your way? I guess the third piece that I'll just share with you, and so this isn't about our structure or, dues or things like that, or membership, and by the way, we don't have dues and we're not a membership organization. But I guess the third thing is that it's not simply about serving people. It's serving people in service of a greater vision. And so we call that vision the Torah of inclusion. Whenever we close things off because we're afraid of what will happen if we don't, we get smaller than we have to be. And there's all sorts of reasons for fear that, for example, that we might want to close things off. What would Judaism look like if we had no fear?
As I was listening to you describe the difference between falling in love with Judaism, which is what many rabbis do, and some alternative approach, I'm reminded of an idea that I've been trying to flesh out lately, where I've been saying that Judaism is the paint, not the painting, meaning that it's a material of art. And when we say the word Judaism, and we use the word Judaism in our name as well for reasons that are not dissimilar from what you described, and we say Judaism and not Jewish, and people have asked us the same questions, but I think that sometimes when you talk about Judaism, you're talking about the system, the whole way everything fits together, meaning we can't make any changes to it because then it wouldn't be Judaism anymore. The system, the connective tissue is Judaism, as opposed to Judaism is this bunch of raw material, some of which is amazing, some of which it would be fine to get rid of, and I think that everybody who's doing this, whether they're a rabbi or not a rabbi, if you're involved in this, it's probably because you really do love some of that stuff and perhaps a lot of it. And so I think that sometimes it's a false dichotomy whether it has to be about Jews or Judaism, because it's really that third thing. It's that there's amazing stuff here, but maybe it doesn't have to be organized in exactly the way it's always been organized, or maybe there's stuff in here that, being honest, is not so amazing, and rabbis aren't allowed to say that, but I also love so much of this, right? But what I don't feel is the need to keep it organized in precisely the same way that it has been for a long time.
New slogan, Judaism Unbound 2020. We really do like some of this Jewish stuff. Quoth Dan Levinson. No, just kidding. But I'm jumping in a little bit because we are arcing towards the close, but mostly for a much better reason than that, not to interrupt our guests, but instead to celebrate our guests before we go, because before Caryn Aviv leaves, we need to wish you a huge mazel tov on the fact that you just became a rabbi. That is fantastic. And in true Judaism Unbound spirit, I also want to complicate the congratulations with all of the threads of our show about what a rabbi is and what a rabbinic role is. And so you, as someone who has just experienced this, are somebody ripe for questions about what a rabbi is. So just to close, this could, of course, be an entire separate episode, but you're now this new thing. To what extent do you feel that changes you and the work that you do? And to what extent doesn't it? And how does it link to just ways that our Jewish world is shifting in general right now, ways that authority is shifting in general in our society right now, all of those threads. So take us out. I know it's a hard ask, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts. And Brian, also, if you would like to add afterwards, that'd be great.
Sure. I think Brian would agree with me that I started acting in a rabbinic capacity the day I started working full time 7 years ago at Judaism Your Way, albeit not really knowing what I was doing and being super open with beginner's mind to learn everything I possibly could. What hasn't changed is that working in this capacity without the title is in some ways super liberating. And people were calling me rabbi years ago, and I always felt obligated to correct them. No, not yet. Thank you. And so now when people say Rabbi Caryn, I'm like, I don't correct them. And so that's a relief, because it's socially awkward to constantly correct people or say not yet. And, it's a humility practice that gets tedious after a while. And the other thing is, I I received rabbinic ordination on a Sunday last month, and I showed up to work, albeit very tired, on Monday morning, and was doing exactly the same thing that I was doing for the past 7 years, which is trying to really listen to who's standing before me and offer something creative and welcoming and inclusive to them. So I don't think you need to be a rabbi to do this work. That's a heretical, perhaps radical thing to say, but I really don't think you need to be a rabbi to do this work. I think the training and the learning and the knowledge helps. And I yearn for the day when we can offer this Torah of inclusion to lots of people around the country who want to do this kind of work, no matter what their training or background. And I think that that's a potential future direction long down the road. We're not ready for prime time on that, but it's possible to do this work that's out of the box and progressive and visionary without having that title. In fact, sometimes I think maybe perhaps that's a blessing that you don't have the title.
When we were just chatting beforehand, I think, Dan, it was you who brought up that, something kind of a truism in Jewish renewal that we're kind of emerging into like the third era of Judaism, if you will, and that each era was characterized by unique authority titles and authority figures and ways of understanding what's true. So we're in this process that's very analogous to what happened 2,000 years ago when our people were shifting and evolving into a whole new world and a whole new way of being. So there's just so much that we just don't know. Just like 2,000 years ago, the early rabbis had no idea if what they were proposing was going to have legs. They had no idea. What I think about rabbi is emblazoned on a cup that I received when I graduated back in 1994. We all got these coffee mugs, and the cup said Shalom Rav, which is a pun. Shalom Rav means hello, Rabbi. But Shalom Rav also is, the name of a prayer in the evening, which means expansive peace or expansive completeness. I think that our training is to use Judaism to offer people the most expansive, complete vision of what it means to be a human being. And we've been blessed with the teachers and the training to have access to some of those tools. A lot of people project a lot of stuff onto people who have our title. And some of that is deserved because a lot of people have been hurt by people who've had our title. And a lot of authority has been abused by people who've had our title. And a lot of doors have been closed and boxes have been shut on people by people who have our title. All I can say is that in this time, this evolving, changing, shifting, uncertain time, that what it means to be a rabbi is to be a rav, is to hold spaciousness for what's next.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on the mugs. I got 2 mugs for my ordination.
2? You got yes.
2? One mug was from my director of study that said, "Keep calm and rabbi on." And the other mug says, "Mother effing rabbi." And so there you go, in a nutshell. You clink them together, and that is the kind of rabbi I aspire to be.
Yo, that's awesome. Thank you both so much for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you for having us.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we hope that you'll continue the journey through the rest of our Passover unit of episodes. It's been a fun one so far. We want to close out this episode in the same way that we always do, by encouraging you to be in touch with us. And there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that, starting with one we already mentioned in the episode. I said that assignment, riffing off of Brian's idea of assigning folks different parts of the Seder that they'll bring. I would love, and we would love, that if you take on that assignment, if you are in touch with your Seder guests or your Seder hosts to get their input and make your Seder a little bit more small d democratic, a little bit more horizontally structured, where all sorts of people are leading different parts, that would be awesome, and let us know about it. So These are the different channels you can use to let us know. There's our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second, there's our Twitter feed at Judaism Unbound. Third, there's our website, JudaismUnbound.com. And last but not least, there is our email addresses. There are our email addresses, Dan@JudaismUnbound.com or Lex@JudaismUnbound.com. The last request we like to make is that we deeply, deeply appreciate any amount of financial support that you can send our way. And you can send that on either a monthly recurring basis or just as a one-time gift at JudaismUnbound.com/donate. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.